If there was one place in the world where the ultra-rich could do whatever they pleased, it was at Gabriel Santiago's party. The crystal chandeliers shimmered against the towering ceiling, casting a golden glow over the clinking glasses of deep red wine held by Manila's most powerful elite. A live orchestra played a soft, elegant melody, weaving seamlessly into the hushed laughter of women adorned in shimmering gowns, their jewelry glittering as brightly as their ambitions. Amidst this extravagant display of wealth, Gabriel Santiago sat with effortless dominance in a sleek Italian leather chair, swirling a glass of top-shelf whiskey between his fingers. His piercing gaze, sharp as a blade, surveyed the room with calculated precision. He was the embodiment of power and control, a man who had never known failure in any game he played. Money, women, business, everything bent to his will. But tonight, a challenge awaited him, one he hadn't seen coming. Across the grand banquet table, Victor de la Cruz, a cunning businessman with a talent for provocation, raised his glass, his eyes glinting with mischief. His voice, smooth yet laced with mockery, cut through the air, shattering the fragile veneer of polite conversation. "Gabriel, you always say money can buy anything. What if I challenge you to marry a woman outside our world, someone far from high society, transform her into a true lady within 3 months? Do you dare?" A hush fell over the room. All eyes turned toward Gabriel, curiosity flickering like embers in the dimly lit space. The glow of the chandeliers reflected against his sculpted features, but his eyes remained cold, unreadable. He leaned back in his chair, bringing the glass of whiskey to his lips, his smirk barely perceptible. "I could do it in less than 3 months," he mused, his tone dripping with amusement as if the idea was nothing more than a child's game. But Victor wasn't finished. Arching an eyebrow, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a blank check, placing it on the gleaming glass table with a crisp, deliberate clink. "Then let's make it interesting. 200 millones de pesos. If you fail, the money is mine." Gabriel glanced down at the check, then back up at Victor, his expression unflinching. This wasn't just a bet. It was a statement, a test of dominance. How could a woman from the lower class possibly resist the luxury and privilege he could offer? "Done," he said, smoothly picking up the pen and signing his name with unwavering confidence. 3 months, I will turn anyone into the perfect high society lady." Victor smirked, pleased. He knew Gabriel had never tasted defeat, and that was exactly what made this game so enticing. But the woman at the center of this bet had no idea what was coming. The air inside Gabriel Santiago's office was thick with the scent of aged whiskey and polished mahogany, a stark contrast to the suffocating silence filling the space. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the dazzling skyline of Manila, where neon lights blinked like scattered diamonds against the night. But inside, beneath the golden glow of his desk lamp, everything felt heavy. Seated across from him, Elena Reyes sat motionless, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, knuckles white with tension. The leather chair beneath her felt too plush, too foreign. Nothing like the rickety wooden stools she was used to in the staff quarters, where she spent late nights scrubbing dishes long after everyone else had gone to bed. She had been summoned here under the guise of a work discussion. But the moment Gabriel had spoken, the ground beneath her had all but crumbled. Marriage. 3 months. More money than she could ever dream of. Gabriel leaned forward, the sharp angles of his tailored suit catching the dim light. His mere presence filled the room, commanding, calculating. He had already run the numbers, weighed the risks, and in his mind there was only one possible outcome. She would say yes. But Elena's world did not operate on power or cold calculations. It ran on sacrifice, on obligation, on the never-ending burden of survival, Her first instinct was to refuse. The word barely formed on her tongue before she forced herself to say it. No. Gabriel did not flinch. He had anticipated resistance. Resistance was simply an obstacle to be overcome. With the ease of a man who always got what he wanted, he slid open his desk drawer and pulled out a check. He barely spared it a glance as he flicked it onto the desk between them, the paper whispering across the polished wood like a finality. The number on it was staggering. It was more money than she could make in a lifetime. More than enough to pull Matteo, her fragile little brother, from the brink of the illness that had drained what little savings she had. Elena's breath caught in her throat. Gabriel said nothing. He didn't need to. He had seen this moment play out before. The split second of hesitation when people grappled with their own moral code, fighting a battle they were already doomed to lose. He watched as her fingers trembled, reaching out but never quite touching the check. She could hear the doctor's voice in her head. If we had started treatment sooner. The check blurred before her eyes. This wasn't a choice. It was a sentence. When she finally looked up, meeting the gaze of the man who had just rewritten her entire fate, her voice was barely a whisper. Fine. And just like that, the deal was sealed. The wedding was nothing short of a spectacle. A grand cathedral in Makati, gilded in gold and drowning in wealth, played host to the union of a millionaire and a nobody. Chandeliers burned like fire above a crowd of Manila's most powerful elite, their voices humming in delighted curiosity. This wasn't a love story. It was a transaction. Gabriel played his part to perfection. He greeted guests with effortless charm, his hand resting lightly on Elena's back, a touch that should have felt intimate, but only sent a cold shiver down her spine. Everything was orchestrated flawlessly, because perfection was what Gabriel demanded. Elena, however, felt like a ghost in her own wedding. The lace of her designer gown clung to her skin like a second prison. The diamond ring on her finger was heavier than any chain. The whispers followed her everywhere, snaking through the air like venom. Who is she? I heard she was a maid. Can you imagine? He must have lost a bet. If only they knew how close they were to the truth. When the priest finally spoke the fateful words, when Gabriel Santiago tilted her chin and pressed his lips to hers before the flash of 100 cameras, Elena had never felt so alone in her entire life. Montero Estate was a world she did not belong to. The floors gleamed with black marble polished to a mirror's reflection. The grand staircase twisted and coiled like a serpent leading to the unknown. Every surface gleamed with wealth, an unspoken reminder that she was now a part of something much larger than herself. Their first night in the mansion, Gabriel assigned her a separate bedroom. The space was larger than the apartment she grew up in. The bed, covered in silk sheets she was afraid to wrinkle, felt more like a throne than a place to rest. The closet was filled with dresses, shoes, and accessories, all meticulously chosen for her transformation. But Elena refused to be molded. The next morning, a team of stylists arrived at Gabriel's command. They knocked politely, awaiting her compliance. She slammed the door in their faces. She refused the etiquette lessons. She refused to play the role of the obedient wife. She refused to speak at the extravagant dinner parties Gabriel hosted, where every guest was a vulture disguised in silk and suits. Most of all, she refused him. Gabriel had expected reluctance, but not defiance. Women bent to his will. They always had. Yet, here she was, standing tall, her head held high, a woman who refused to be bought. And for the first time in his life, Gabriel Santiago was losing control. Days blurred into weeks, and something unspoken began to shift between them. Gabriel started noticing things he shouldn't. The way Elena clutched a small, worn locket hidden beneath her dress. Something old, something cherished. The way she sat in the gardens late at night, staring at the stars as if searching for something lost. The way she met his gaze without fear, without admiration, only quiet defiance. She was not like the women he had known. She was fire where they were silk. She was steel where they were glass. And despite everything, despite knowing this was all just a game, Gabriel couldn't look away. For the first time, he wasn't sure if he was the one in control anymore. Gabriel Santiago did not lose, not in business, not in power, not in control. But this was different, because in a game like this, there were only two possible endings. One of them would surrender, or they would both go up in flames. At first, Gabriel Santiago treated marriage like a contract, an equation with a predictable outcome. But something unexpected was beginning to happen. It started subtly, a flicker of curiosity where there should have been indifference. Elena was supposed to be a means to an end, a pawn in a wager, a woman to be shaped and molded like every other socialite in his world. Yet, instead of yielding, she resisted at every turn, moving through his grand estate with quiet defiance, her presence like an ember smoldering beneath cold marble floors. He should have been irritated. Instead, he found himself watching. The estate's ballroom shimmered under the glow of chandeliers, their crystals refracting golden light across rows of tailored suits and sequined gowns. It was a night of power plays, an evening where business deals were sealed with the clink of champagne glasses and well-rehearsed laughter. Gabriel had been here 1,000 times before. He knew how the game was played. But tonight, something felt different. Across the room, Victor de la Cruz leaned in, his lips curling into a smirk as he whispered something to the surrounding crowd. Their laughter was sharp. Too sharp. And then Elena's name fell from his lips. Gabriel didn't have to hear the words to know they were meant to humiliate. Elena, the maid who became a millionaire's wife, the nobody thrown into a world of silk and diamonds, standing in a place where she didn't belong. But instead of shrinking away, Elena lifted her chin. The conversation stilled. All eyes turned toward her. And then, with an ease that caught everyone, including Gabriel, off guard, she responded. It wasn't defensive, it wasn't meek, it was calculated, intelligent. A masterful retort that left Victor stunned and the onlookers scrambling to mask their amusement. Gabriel watched as the smirk slowly vanished from Victor's face, his confidence cracking just enough for the tables to turn. The laughter this time? It wasn't at Elena, and that was when Gabriel saw her differently. Not as the woman trapped in this wager, not as the defiant maid he thought he could break, but as a force he had completely underestimated. Elena moved through his world in ways he never expected. She didn't just endure the whispered judgments of the elite. She dismantled them, one sharp remark at a time. She didn't just live in Montero Estate. She became a part of it. The staff, once wary of her presence, now spoke about her in hushed admiration. Gabriel noticed it in the way the maids smiled when she passed, the way the head butler now took time to listen rather than dismiss. And it bothered him, not because she was winning them over, but because she was becoming something more than the woman he had chosen for this game. She was redefining her place. And he wasn't sure what to do about that. The storm outside beat relentlessly against the floor-to-ceiling windows of his study. The Manila skyline swallowed in dark clouds and fractured lightning. Gabriel sat at his desk, whiskey untouched, papers forgotten. He was drowning in a silence he didn't know how to fill. Then, a quiet knock. He looked up, expecting one of the staff. But it was her. Elena stood in the doorway, a tray in her hands. Not champagne, not a carefully crafted drink of wealth, just tea. She didn't say a word as she placed it down in front of him. She simply poured, the steam curling between them like something unspoken. Gabriel studied her, the woman he had once thought so small, so insignificant. But there was nothing small about her. She was unshaken, resilient. The only person in his entire world who didn't treat him like something untouchable. For the first time, he saw her not as the girl who didn't belong, but as the only real thing in a world of illusion. And it terrified him, because Gabriel Santiago did not lose control. But in that moment, he felt something slip. Days passed. Then weeks, and everything changed. Gabriel, once arrogant, untouchable, amused by this game, found himself listening when Elena spoke. He found himself noticing things he never should have. The way she stood in the garden at night, staring at the stars as if searching for something lost. The way she touched an old locket beneath her dress, a relic from a past she never spoke of. The way she challenged him without fear. She wasn't afraid of him, and that unsettled him more than anything else. Because Gabriel Santiago had spent his entire life believing people could be bought. But Elena Reyes had never been for sale. This was supposed to be simple. A bet, a wager, a game with a clear ending. But something had changed. Gabriel didn't know when it had started. Maybe it was the moment she refused to bow to him. Maybe it was the moment she silenced Victor with nothing but words. Maybe it was the night she brought him tea. Or maybe it was happening all along, and he had been too blind to see it. All he knew was this. Elena Reyes was no longer just the woman he married for a wager. She was the only thing he couldn't control. And for the first time in his life, Gabriel Santiago wasn't sure if he wanted to. The evening unfolded like a grand performance, ornate, extravagant, meticulously curated for those who thrived in deception. The Montero estate, bathed in the glow of golden chandeliers, was alive with murmured conversations and the clinking of crystal glasses. Elegantly dressed guests drifted through the ballroom, each step measured, each laugh rehearsed. But beneath the surface, something far darker loomed. Elena stood near the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, her fingers absent-mindedly grazing the delicate stem of a champagne flute she hadn't touched. Beyond the glass, the Manila skyline shimmered, a constellation of artificial stars, a city full of illusions. It was fitting, because tonight she would learn that her world was an illusion, too. Victor de la Cruz thrived in spaces like this, where power was currency and destruction was a form of sport. He moved through the crowd effortlessly, a shadow weaving between silken gowns and tailored suits, his presence commanding yet almost unnoticeable, until it wasn't. His voice, rich with amusement, carried just enough to be heard by those meant to hear it. Especially her. A single sentence. Casual, offhand. The kind of remark that was designed to slip into the mind like a splinter. And yet it cut deeper than any blade, a bet, a game, a challenge to transform her into something more palatable, more refined, more worthy of standing by Gabriel Santiago's side. The room did not freeze. No one gasped in horror. But for Elena, the world tilted. The carefully composed night blurred at the edges, voices warping, the glow of chandeliers suddenly harsh and blinding. She turned, searching, and found him. Gabriel, standing near the bar, expression unreadable, hands wrapped around a glass of whiskey he hadn't yet sipped. His silence was suffocating. It confirmed everything. The weight of it settled in her chest like stone. It wasn't just the deception. It wasn't just that she had been a pawn in some twisted, ego-fueled wager. It was the fact that she had started to believe. She had let herself soften. She had let herself want. The moments between them, the quiet nights, the rare smiles, the way his gaze had started to linger as if she were something more than a fleeting amusement, had all been a carefully constructed illusion. A performance so convincing she had played her part without knowing. Her fingers tightened around the fragile stem of her untouched glass. It shattered in her grip. The tiny gasp of a nearby guest, the swift movement of a waiter rushing forward with a napkin. None of it registered. All she could hear was the hollow ringing in her ears. All she could see was Gabriel Santiago watching her, saying nothing. She left before she could break apart where the world could see. The halls of the estate blurred as she walked, each step more frantic, more desperate to put distance between herself and the suffocating weight of realization. By the time she reached the entrance, she was running. The night air hit her like a slap, sharp and unforgiving. Her breath came fast, her pulse a wild drumbeat in her ears. She didn't stop, didn't pause to look back. Because if she did, if she saw him standing there, if she saw even a flicker of regret in his face, she might shatter completely. Inside, Gabriel watched the doors swing shut behind her. His fingers tightened around his glass before he let it fall. The sound of breaking crystal was lost beneath the music, beneath the hum of conversation, beneath the weight of what he had just lost. Because for the first time in his life, Gabriel Santiago understood something terrifying. This hadn't been a game in a long time. And now he had no idea how to win her back. The Montero estate, once alive with opulence and revelry, had become a mausoleum of unspoken words and empty halls. Gabriel Santiago no longer hosted lavish parties. The grand chandeliers no longer illuminated evenings of laughter, and the orchestras no longer played for guests dressed in silk and diamonds. The air inside was thick, heavy with something unseen but deeply felt. A presence of absence. Elena was gone, and with her, the meaning behind everything he had built. The man who had everything and nothing. At all for years, wealth had been his identity. It had shaped him, armored him, isolated him. But now, for the first time, money felt weightless, useless. No number in his bank account could erase the look on Elena's face that night. The way her hands had trembled before she turned away. The way she had run, not just from him, but from everything he represented. The realization gnawed at him. The man he had been was not someone worth loving. And for the first time in his life, Gabriel Santiago wanted to be. The decision wasn't dramatic. There was no grand declaration, no moment of divine epiphany. Just a quiet morning, alone in his office, staring at the unopened bottle of whiskey on his desk. The same bottle he once poured so easily, drowning out anything real. He pushed it aside. That was the first step. The next came in unexpected ways. The charities he once dismissed as publicity stunts became causes he truly saw. He walked through shelters, met children who slept in alleyways and studied by candlelight. He didn't just donate. He listened. He didn't just sign checks. He stayed. There was one particular project, one centered on education for street children. A school built in a forgotten part of the city, one with crumbling walls and rusted swings. A school that, once upon a time, Elena had spoken of with a quiet dream in her voice. Now it bore her name. The world noticed. Gabriel Santiago, once a symbol of excess and arrogance, had become something else entirely. The headlines shifted from his extravagant parties to his unexpected philanthropy. And Elena saw. Not in person, but through newspapers left on cafe tables, through whispered conversations she overheard, through the grainy television screen in the small rented room where she had been rebuilding a life away from him. But the question remained. Was it real, or was this too a performance? She had trusted him once. Could she ever trust him again? A story not yet finished. Gabriel didn't know if she would ever come back. But this time, for the first time, he wasn't doing it to win. He was doing it because she had been right about him all along. Because he had once believed that everything in life was transactional. That people, like business deals, could be won or lost. But love was never something to be played with. And if he ever had the chance, he would spend the rest of his life proving it to her. The evening was nothing like the grand, excessive parties Gabriel Santiago used to host. No crystal chandeliers casting golden light onto silk gowns. No glittering glasses filled with $1,000 champagne. No symphony playing to an audience too rich to truly listen. Instead, the air was filled with the sounds of children's laughter. The venue was not a 5-star ballroom, but an old community center, one Gabriel had restored himself. Strings of fairy lights hung from the ceilings, casting a warm glow over long wooden tables lined with home-cooked food. The guests? Street children, once lost in the cracks of society, now given a second chance. And among them, Elena. She had almost refused to come. The invitation had arrived in the simplest form. A handwritten note, unlike the engraved gilded ones she had once seen at his extravagant events. No demands, no expectations. Just a quiet request. She wasn't sure why she came. Perhaps it was curiosity. Perhaps it was the nagging thought that, despite everything, a part of her still wanted to believe in him. But nothing could have prepared her for what she was about to see. Gabriel was no longer the man who had once stood at the top of a glass tower, believing the world could be bought and bent to his will. He had shed that version of himself like an old, ill-fitting suit. He moved through the room differently now, no longer above others, but among them. He knelt beside children as they showed him their drawings, laughed as one of them smeared cake on his shirt, listened intently as a young girl whispered a secret in his ear. He was different, and that scared Elena more than if he had stayed the same. Because if this was real, if he had truly changed, what did it mean for everything she had told herself? The music stopped. Gabriel stood at the center of the room now, but not as a man used to commanding attention. His hands were empty. No wine glass, no expensive gifts, nothing but the weight of the moment. And then, he knelt. The room fell silent. The children, the volunteers, the guests, all held their breath. Elena's heart pounded, not out of fear, but because something inside her already knew what was coming. He reached into his pocket, not for a dazzling diamond ring, not for some extravagant display of wealth, but for something simpler, something far more meaningful. A small, delicate band, a ring crafted not for spectacle, but for her. His voice was steady, but his eyes held something she had never seen before. Vulnerability. This wasn't a game, not a bet, not a challenge. For the first time, Gabriel Santiago was giving someone, not just his wealth, not just his name, but himself. Tears welled up in Elena's eyes before she could stop them. For so long, she had seen him as the man who took everything lightly, who played with lives like they were pieces on a chessboard. But now, as he knelt before her, not as a millionaire, not as a man used to winning, but as someone who had finally learned what love truly meant, she saw him. Really saw him. And for the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid to let someone in. Her answer wasn't just a word. It was a new beginning. This time, there were no headlines, no whispers, no eyes watching to see if it was all just another performance. There were no silk-gloved hands holding champagne flutes, no reporters waiting for a scandal to unfold, no cold, calculated expectations shaping a moment that was meant to be real. Because this time, it was. The wedding was nothing like their first. It wasn't held in a grand cathedral, nor was it adorned with golden chandeliers and diamond-studded centerpieces. There were no politicians, no billionaires, no socialites pretending to care. Instead, it was quiet, intimate, held in the very garden where Elena had once sat under the stars, lost in thoughts of a life that had never truly belonged to her. But tonight, she belonged here. Flowers, simple yet beautiful, lined the aisle. Children, the very ones Gabriel had spent months helping, ran barefoot between the guests, their laughter filling the air like a song only the heart could hear. And there, at the end of the aisle, stood the man she had once thought incapable of change. No longer a man playing a role, no longer a man trying to prove a point. Just Gabriel. And for the first time, when he reached for her hand, she didn't hesitate. A love that was never for sale. The vows were spoken without obligation. There were no contracts, no expectations of transformation, no hidden bets lurking in the shadows of their words. There was just truth. Gabriel promised not riches, but honesty. Elena promised not submission, but trust. And when he slipped the ring onto her finger, it was no longer a symbol of control, no longer a marker of a wager made between two men who had once seen love as a game. It was a promise, a real one. And when he kissed her, there were no cameras, no staged perfection. Just them. Two souls who had fought, broken, and rebuilt themselves, not for a game, not for a prize, but for each other. As they danced under the soft glow of hanging lanterns, surrounded by laughter, by warmth, by genuine joy, a thought lingered. Could a man like Gabriel Santiago truly change? Could a heart once blinded by arrogance and power learn to love not through possession, but through sacrifice? And if you were Elena, could you forgive? What do you think? Was Gabriel's redemption real? If you were in Elena's place, would you have given him a second chance?